Wilhelm Keitel, historically recognized, was born on September 22, 1882, at the Keitel ancestral home situated in Helmscherode, close to Gandersheim, within the Lower Harz Mountains of north-central Germany. His father was Karl Keitel, who, despite being a landowner of middle-class standing and possessing a 650-acre estate in Helmscherode, struggled financially due to the inferior quality of the soil and the challenges associated with managing his extensive landholding. Wilhelm's mother, Apollonia Wissering, originated from a long-established lineage of tenant farmers residing in the Harz Mountain region. Wilhelm's acquaintance with her was limited, however, as she passed away during childbirth while delivering his younger brother Baudouin when Wilhelm was merely 6 years of age. The Keitel family had come into possession of their lands in Helmscherode in 1871. This year held considerable significance. It marked the same year that approximately 30 small to medium-sized German states were unified into a German empire under the aegis of Prussia, the most dominant German state. This pivotal event in European political history was orchestrated by Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian statesman, in the aftermath of a series of conflicts against Austria, Denmark, and France. The consolidation of Germany into a unified nation, encompassing much of present-day Western and Northern Poland, engendered a formidable entity in Central Europe, disrupting the continental power equilibrium. Boasting substantial territorial, military, political, and economic might, the nascent German Empire was a power capable of challenging Great Britain, Europe's preeminent force. And indeed it would. During Wilhelm's formative years in the 1880s and 1890s, Europe underwent a division into two factions. One spearheaded by Germany, allied with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the other consisting of France and Russia. Britain, for the time being, maintained a detached stance, yet this period signified the inception of a protracted, gradual descent toward a catastrophic continental war. Wilhelm's early life was largely devoid of political involvement. The Keitel family's concerns primarily revolved around agriculture, horses, and hunting. Events in Berlin generally impacted them only insofar as they pertained to protective tariffs influencing agricultural pursuits. For his education, Wilhelm was instructed by a private tutor. He proved to be only a mediocre student, although his teacher nonetheless acknowledged his intelligence. Subsequently, he narrowly achieved graduation from the Göttingen Gymnasium, a matter of little concern to him as he envisioned his future within familial occupations and anticipated assuming control of a segment of the Keitel farm in later years. However, his late teenage years witnessed a transformation, and Wilhelm resolved to pursue a military career instead. This shift perhaps reflected prevailing trends, as European armies were expanding and nations were vying to colonize the remaining uncolonized territories outside Europe. Wilhelm's decision to enlist in the Prussian military, which retained a distinct identity within the German Empire, was perhaps doubly surprising, given that the Keitel family's consistent political stance involved a disdain for Prussian hegemony within the Federal German Empire, a background that would distinguish him from many of his fellow officers in the German army in subsequent years. In 1901, Wilhelm enlisted in the 46th Prussian Field Artillery Regiment, stationed near Brunswick, not far from his home. Due to his middle-class origins, he was promptly appointed as a junior officer and swiftly demonstrated his aptitude through his intelligence and efficiency. Serving as a second lieutenant, his superiors recognized his talent for sound organizational and tactical decision-making, a critical attribute for an effective commander. Lisa possessed culture, erudition, and a fondness for music. Wilhelm exhibited a more somber disposition, with long-term acquaintances observing that he had likely never perused a book outside the realm of military tactics or warfare history. They welcomed their firstborn, a daughter named Nona, in 1911, followed by several more offspring, including 3 sons, Karl Heinz, Ernst, and Hans Georg, all of whom would emulate their father's path into the German military. Wilhelm's life, akin to that of countless Europeans, underwent a dramatic transformation in the 1910s. Between 1910 and 1914, a series of regional crises had emerged across the continent and in parts of Africa, notably Morocco, each threatening to escalate the long-simmering tensions among European powers into full-scale war. By this juncture, Britain had aligned itself with France and Russia, and the battle lines were relatively well-defined, pitting these nations against the combined forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Balkans, in particular, had proven to be a volatile region, following the decline of Ottoman Empire control there. The nascent states that arose competed with each other, with Austria-Hungary and with Russia for territorial dominance. Two minor wars transpired in this region in the early 1910s. But the event that truly ignited tensions was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the streets of Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, perpetrated by a Serbian nationalist. A regional conflict ensued in the ensuing weeks, involving Austria-Hungary, Serbia, and Russia, which escalated by late July to encompass Germany, France, and Britain. With diplomatic efforts failing, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, precipitating reciprocal declarations of war among European powers. By August 4th, Germany and Austria-Hungary were engaged in war against Britain, France, and Russia. With the onset of the First World War in the subsequent months, Keitel was deployed with the 46th Artillery to Flanders in Belgium, which Germany had invaded to establish a route into northeastern France. The majority of combat on the Western Front, pitting Germans against French and British forces, would unfold in this region of France over the ensuing 4 years, across an extensive strip of land spanning from Paris to the Belgian border. Keitel, however, did not witness substantial action initially. Shortly after his arrival on the Western Front, he sustained an arm injury from shrapnel during an explosion in September 1914. Nevertheless, he soon recuperated, and upon recovery, he was appointed to the General Staff of the German military. His superiors had been apprised of his exceptional organizational capabilities and brought Keitel into central planning operations on the Western Front. His promotion also stemmed from his artillery background. As the war evolved into a largely static conflict between armies entrenched in subterranean trenches in northeastern France, artillery emerged as the primary means of engaging the enemy through intense barrages preceding any forward movement from the trenches. It is therefore unsurprising that many individuals promoted within the German military during the First World War originated from artillery regiments. Artillery, or any other weapon, could not secure victory for Germany, even though its military proved more effective than those of Britain, France, or Russia throughout the war. The fundamental issue was purely mathematical and logistical. Germany possessed fewer reserves of soldiers and was decisively outnumbered once the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France in 1917. Furthermore, the German economy was experiencing critical shortages of essential goods required to sustain the war effort. Unrest, both within the armed forces and among the civilian population in Germany, ultimately precipitated the war's conclusion before the Germans suffered complete battlefield defeat. Following a series of uprisings in Germany in early November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, bringing the German Empire to an end. 2 days thereafter, an armistice was signed, signaling the cessation of the First World War. The peace treaties in the ensuing 2 years, notably the Treaty of Versailles, effectively divested Germany of substantial territory to establish a newly independent Poland and imposed exorbitant war reparations upon the nation. Of particular significance for Keitel, the German Republic was mandated to demobilize the majority of its armed forces, maintaining an army of a size that would preclude any future threat to Britain and France. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and officers who desired to remain in military service were demobilized in 1919 and 1920, generating a vast cohort of disillusioned young and middle-aged German men who began to join paramilitary organizations in Germany in the early 1920s. Their grievances concerning Germany's post-war status and their individual roles therein would be exploited by other embittered individuals, with dire ramifications for Germany and Europe in the long term. Keitel was not among these individuals. In the war's final stages, he had received successive promotions, becoming the first general staff officer of a reserve infantry division and subsequently assuming the same command position within a Marine Corps stationed in Flanders. The provisions of the Treaty of Versailles pertaining to German demobilization and disarmament were exceedingly stringent. For instance, the newly limited German military force, designated the Reichswehr, meaning Reich defense, was prohibited from possessing tanks developed during the First World War, nor was it permitted to maintain an air force. Artillery was permissible, but only with ordnance capable of firing small 10.5 caliber shells. Moreover, troop numbers were, as noted, capped at 100,000 men, and the general staff, the officer corps that had directed the war for Germany, was prescribed. Consequently, Keitel and numerous other officers within the Reichswehr were tasked throughout the early 1920s by the new Chief of Staff, General Hans von Seeckt, with circumventing these regulations. Former members of the General Staff, such as Keitel, were, for example, simply reclassified as officers of a new Truppenamt, or troop office. Keitel would serve as a colonel and branch chief within the Truppenamt until 1933. Throughout this period, von Seeckt instructed commanders like Keitel to organize their units, such that for every soldier officially registered in the Reichswehr, there were 2 additional, unofficially trained personnel who could be rapidly mobilized if necessary. Consequently, the Reichswehr consistently maintained troop strength approximately 3 times greater than permitted under the Treaty of Versailles throughout the 1920s. While Keitel and his fellow officers endeavored to maximize the circumvention of the Treaty of Versailles during the 1920s, broader German politics underwent substantial transformations. The early 1920s witnessed widespread discontent among significant segments of the population regarding the war's conclusion, and particularly, as previously noted, among young and middle-aged men who had served in the military. Many of these individuals joined paramilitary units such as the Freikorps or Free Corps. One such unit, based in Munich, Bavaria, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. By 1923, they were largely led by an Austrian demagogue named Adolf Hitler, who had fought and sustained injuries in the war. In early November 1923, they even attempted a regional coup d'etat, or putsch, in Munich. It collapsed within hours, and Hitler was subsequently arrested, tried, and sentenced to several years of imprisonment. But the mere fact of this attempt signaled simmering resentment among certain factions of the German populace concerning the post-war settlement. The mid-1920s ushered in greater stability to German politics. The nation began to reap the benefits of the post-war economic boom, leading to the era being known as the Roaring Twenties. Jazz resonated in every city's music venues, individuals frequently experienced their first silent films at cinemas, and German Expressionism, centered in Berlin, became the preeminent cultural movement globally during the 1920s. However, this prosperity proved ephemeral. In the autumn of 1929, stock markets on Wall Street in New York City suffered catastrophic losses as the global economy cooled dramatically following years of expansion. A Great Depression ensued, and Germany's economy was particularly adversely affected. Unemployment lines elongated, and soon individuals began to exhaust their financial resources. The wealthier echelons of society soon witnessed their life savings decimated by rampant inflation. Concurrently, the centrist parties that had governed the Weimar Republic throughout the 1920s rapidly lost ground to more extremist factions. On the left, the communists garnered increasing support, while the Nazis emerged as the primary beneficiaries on the right. In the Reichstag elections held in the summer of 1932, they secured 37% of the vote, obtaining 230 seats in the 608-seat parliament. The centrist elements within the government remained resolute in excluding them from power, but the sustainability of this stance remained uncertain. Throughout these years, Keitel continued to serve in a diverse array of capacities within the German armed forces. A notable assignment arose in 1931 when he was dispatched to Moscow. The German government had established an agreement with the government of Joseph Stalin in the Communist Soviet Union during the 1920s, wherein officers of the Red Army received tutelage from German officers remaining within the Reichswehr, widely considered to be the foremost tactical commanders globally. In reciprocity, the Red Army permitted Germans to train soldiers within Russia, ensuring they were not officially tallied as part of the sanctioned 100,000-strong Reichswehr back in Germany. During his secondment in 1931, Keitel was impressed by the vastness of the Soviet Empire and the sheer size of the Red Army. Consequently, in December 1932, he and his wife journeyed to a spa in High Tatra, Czechoslovakia, for respite and recuperation, a sojourn that extended into early 1933. It was during Keitel's absence from Germany on this leave that he became cognizant of a rapid transformation in the German political landscape. Following a failed minority government under Chancellor Franz von Papen and a subsequent election mere months after the earlier one in the summer of 1932, the political impasse in Berlin persisted. Therefore, in January 1933, a coalition comprising von Papen and leaders of the German business community persuaded German President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as German Chancellor in a coalition government encompassing centrist and right-leaning parties. The centrists harbored the belief that they could manage Hitler, and by integrating him into the government, They would also curtail any further ascendance of left-leaning parties such as the Communists. This assessment proved profoundly erroneous. Within weeks, a new election was convened, in which the Nazis employed intimidation tactics to augment their vote share in parliamentary representation. Subsequently, a fire at the Reichstag was attributed to communist insurgents and leveraged to assert the necessity of enacting an enabling act, which empowered the Nazis to govern by decree. The act's passage on March 23, 1933, signified the demise of the Weimar Republic and the genesis of Nazi Germany. Keitel was not an individual one would inherently earmark for advancement within this nascent dispensation. Politically, he favored von Papen and harbored reservations regarding the Nazis. Nevertheless, they now held dominion over the German state, within whose army Keitel served as a commander. However, the Nazis did not instantaneously seize complete control over the military. Instead, they initiated rearmament but permitted the German officer class to preserve a degree of autonomy throughout much of the 1930s. A personnel change did transpire at the uppermost echelon, with General Werner von Blomberg, the chief of the Truppanamt, now elevated to Minister of Defense within the new regime and effectively placed in command of Germany's armed forces. Von Blomberg and Keitel were long-standing acquaintances, having initially served together during the First World War. Consequently, notwithstanding his personal misgivings about the Nazis, Keitel was soon promoted. On October 1, 1933, he was appointed Major General and Infantry Leader, stationed in Potsdam, while a year later, he was entrusted with overseeing the establishment of a new infantry division based in Bremen, northern Germany, as part of the Nazis' immediate initiative to surpass the quotas and limitations imposed on the German army under the Treaty of Versailles. A primary concern for Keitel at this juncture, shared by numerous other senior officers within the German armed forces in 1933 and 1934, was the prospect of the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, led by Ernst Röhm, attempting to effectively usurp or supersede the German army. By 1934, the SA had burgeoned to encompass 2 million personnel, and its merger with the German armed forces would have resulted in established career officers like Keitel being overshadowed by SA commanders. However, Hitler entertained alternative designs, apprehensive of Röhm's burgeoning influence. On June 30, 1934, a series of purges known as the Night of the Long Knives commenced, dismantling the SA leadership, resulting in Röhm's assassination and largely neutralizing the SA as a threat to either Hitler or the German armed forces. Subsequently, its ranks diminished by 40% during the 1930s, and it lost political influence as a paramilitary entity to Heinrich Himmler's SS. The official German army was further bolstered by an announcement on March 16, 1935, declaring its rearmament not by exceeding the official 100,000-man cap, but by conscripting soldiers who would undergo training but not be employed as career military personnel. This constituted a technical circumvention of restrictions, mirroring certain methodologies employed in the 1920s. In the interim, Keitel's personal perspectives on Hitler and the Nazis had evolved. This shift was not solely attributable to the decisive manner in which the Nazi leader had curtailed the SA's power in 1934, but also to Keitel's inaugural personal encounter with the German Chancellor. Irrespective of the underlying rationale, Keitel subsequently became a committed adherent of the Nazi cause. In 1935, a significant alteration transpired in the management of the German armed forces, bearing substantial implications for the remainder of Keitel's life. On May 21st of that year, the Reichswehr, the armed force established in the aftermath of the First World War, was rebranded and reorganized. Its nomenclature proved misleading, as this juncture marked a pivotal moment in Germany's military expansion toward aggressive warfare. When Hitler proclaimed its creation, he touted its composition of 36 divisions, a figure that would have surpassed the 100,000-man cap imposed under Versailles by at least fivefold. Subsequently, in December, General Ludwig Beck augmented the prescribed buildup with 48 tank battalions, and these measures, coupled with Hermann Göring's establishment of a German air force named the Luftwaffe from the spring of 1935, unequivocally signaled Germany's rearmament in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. Moreover, as the organizational body vested with central oversight of the armed land forces, or HEER, the Air Force, the tank battalions, and the Navy, or Kriegsmarine, the Wehrmacht would constitute the central entity involved in overseeing Germany's rearmament in the ensuing years, a process Hitler initially aimed to complete within a decade, later reducing the time frame to as little as 4 years. The nascent Wehrmacht was headed by General von Blomberg, whose ministerial title also transitioned from Minister of Defense to Minister of War. However, the organizational management of the Wehrmacht would be entrusted to another individual. The individual von Blomberg recommended to Hitler was Wilhelm Keitel. The proposal was seconded by General Werner von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief of the German land forces. However, Keitel initially demurred. While undoubtedly a promotion, it entailed a return to a desk-bound administrative role in Berlin, whereas he had relished his commands of infantry divisions in Potsdam and Bremen. Despite these reservations and at the urging of his wife Lisa, who desired to return to Berlin, he acceded to the position and was appointed chief of the Wehrmacht, subordinate only to von Blomberg within its hierarchy and effectively in charge of the day-to-day operations of the body, vested with overarching oversight of all branches of the German military. Concurrently, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general on New Year's Day 1936, shortly after assuming his new responsibilities in Berlin. Keitel's undertaking proved arduous. Upon assuming office in October 1935, his predecessor as the most senior bureaucrat of the German military, Major General Walter von Reichenau, greeted him attired in tennis attire and presented him with a dossier purportedly containing the most critical documents he would require. Subsequently, von Reichenau departed to engage in tennis, leaving Keitel to administer a rapidly expanding Wehrmacht. Yet the paramount challenge he confronted was not the administrative workload per se, but rather the conflicting jurisdictions of individuals within the various organizations overseen by the Wehrmacht. For instance, as head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring was theoretically Keitel's subordinate, to whom Keitel could issue directives. However, Göring simultaneously held the position of deputy leader of Germany, serving as Hitler's second-in-command. Consequently, Keitel found it challenging to issue commands to Göring and impossible to enforce them should Göring elect not to comply. Analogous jurisdictional ambiguities complicated his role, notably with General von Fritsch, who maintained that the German land forces should manage their affairs autonomously, devoid of any operational oversight. This predicament was exacerbated by Hitler's reluctance to intervene, as he was persuaded that rivalry among his ministers and generals constituted an efficacious means of precluding any individual from amassing excessive power. Despite these constraints, the German armed forces sustained rapid expansion throughout 1936 and 1937. By 1938, the 36 divisions Hitler had proclaimed would be recruited and trained in 1935 had materialized, and the land forces of the Nazi state had burgeoned to 600,000 personnel from the cap of 100,000 just a few years prior. Hundreds of German panzer tanks were in production, and the Luftwaffe had expanded to over 1,000 operational aircraft, comprising a mix of bombers and fighters, while the Kriegsmarine was constructing new U-boat submarines and had commenced construction in 1936 of two colossal battleships, intended to be the largest military vessels afloat globally, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. Keitel occupied the apex of all this activity. From his Berlin office, he oversaw staff members responsible for allocating resources to shipyards and airfields for the construction of ships and aircraft, while the Wehrmacht's central offices were also tasked with overseeing minutiae concerning munitions and artillery ordnance. Effectively, Keitel functioned as the logistician overseeing the practicalities of German rearmament between 1935 and 1939, in the prelude to the Second World War. A significant development impacted Keitel early in 1938. Notwithstanding Hitler and the Nazis' dominion over the German state, the military had consistently preserved a degree of autonomy, with von Blomberg and von Fritsch willing to resist directives from the Nazi leadership. As the impending war approached, Hitler resolved to remove these two figures. A propitious opportunity arose in early 1938. On January 12th of that year, von Blomberg, whose wife had passed away several years prior, remarried Erna Grün. Within days, the Berlin police had acquired intelligence indicating that Grün possessed an extensive criminal history and had once posed for pornographic photographs, in addition to being arrested on charges of prostitution years earlier. This was deemed unacceptable for a minister and commander of the Wehrmacht, and von Blomberg was requested by Hitler to annul the marriage. Von Blomberg refused and instead resigned on January 27th. Subsequently, von Fritsch was also removed from his position as head of the German land forces in early February, completing the removal of the two figures Hitler had come to view as impediments to a more aggressive German military buildup. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair precipitated a restructuring of the German military command structure. Keitel had played a pivotal role in revealing the disclosures regarding von Blomberg's new wife, and his favor with Hitler was ascendant. He had already begun to cultivate the reputation of a pliant yes man, a characteristic that would define him in subsequent years. Therefore, he was selected to succeed von Blomberg in the aftermath of the affair. Hitler assumed direct control of the Wehrmacht himself in anticipation of the impending war, but Keitel remained at the helm of the organizational wing and succeeded von Blomberg as war minister in all but name. He was not accorded ministerial rank, but was appointed to the government cabinet as de facto war minister. Hitler is believed to have desired Keitel for the position based on advisement that he was an efficient bureaucrat who would not impede Hitler's command authority over the Wehrmacht. For his part, Keitel was also promoted to colonel general shortly thereafter and was awarded the Nazi Golden Party Badge, a distinction typically conferred upon individuals who had been party members back in the mid-1920s, when Hitler and his adherents constituted little more than a small collective of disaffected misfits residing in Bavaria. All of these events unfolded as the trajectory toward war accelerated. Germany's rearmament had been succeeded by the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, but subsequent German aggression had been relatively contained. This changed abruptly in early 1938 as internal pressure was applied within Austria to cultivate support for unification with Germany. The Austrian government had faced pressure from Austrian Nazis operating just across the border in southern Germany since 1933. Yet by early 1938, the impetus for unification had become so compelling that a referendum was announced on the matter. Hitler preempted the outcome by deploying German troops into Austria before the vote transpired, and it subsequently passed overwhelmingly, leading to Austria's incorporation into a Greater Germany in March 1938. Subsequently, pressure mounted for Germany to be permitted to annex the Sudetenland in western Czechoslovakia, a region with a substantial ethnic German populace. Britain and France acquiesced to these demands in the autumn of 1938, but this concession did not deter Hitler from effectively annexing the remainder of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939. This act marked the culmination of appeasement, and Berlin was now unequivocally informed that any Nazi aggression against Poland, as proposed, would precipitate war. Amidst these developments, Keitel found himself overwhelmed with responsibilities. Hitler proved to be a demanding taskmaster, particularly given Keitel's unwavering availability at any hour. It was commonplace for the chief bureaucrat of the Wehrmacht to receive nocturnal phone calls from Hitler concerning various operational matters. Moreover, as chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, and de facto Minister of War, Keitel was also expected to attend numerous social functions in Berlin, further depleting his time. These demands were compounded by a deficiency in strategic planning regarding army expansion from early 1938 onward. For instance, during the German land forces' incursion into Austria in the spring of that year, Keitel was aghast to discover the absence of any pre-existing strategy for organizing the operation through his office. The initial steps that would implicate Keitel in war crimes were also emerging during this period. The head of the Wehrmacht appears to have been taken aback when, in the lead-up to the intervention in Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Hitler mused that the assassination of the German ambassador in Prague by Czechs would provide a compelling justification for intervention in the country. The implication of this statement was unambiguous. Hitler was contemplating orchestrating the assassination of Germany's own ambassador to Czechoslovakia as a pretext for intervening in the country. Events of this nature, among numerous others, would later constitute the basis for accusations that Keitel had been directly complicit in instigating war in Europe. Yet more conspicuous developments were also unfolding. The Nazis had consistently espoused rabid anti-Semitism, and shortly after assuming power, had enacted the Nuremberg laws, legislative measures that effectively disenfranchised Germany's Jewish population. Now, on the night of November 9, 1938, pogroms erupted across Germany as Nazi gangs and other Germans assailed thousands of German Jews and their businesses, resulting in numerous murders, injuries, and extensive damage to Jewish synagogues and property. This time, Britain and France unequivocally declared that no concessions would be forthcoming. However, they were caught off guard when, in late August 1939, news emerged of a significant diplomatic accord between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Fascism and communism were ideologically diametrically opposed, Yet a non-aggression pact had been formulated, featuring secret clauses that permitted Berlin and Moscow to effectively partition the territories between their nations in Eastern Europe. Russia would claim dominion over much of the Baltic states and portions of Poland, while Germany would seize the majority of Poland. A few days later, a false flag operation was conducted on the German-Polish border to fabricate the impression of Polish aggression. This latter act was likely superfluous, as its deception was transparent. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, ostensibly in retaliation for this fabricated act of hostility, Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had begun. 2 days prior to the invasion of Poland, Keitel was appointed by Hitler to the Council of Ministers for the Defense of the Reich. This 6-member committee has been interpreted by some as a form of war cabinet. In addition to Keitel, it comprised Hermann Göring, who chaired the council and oversaw both the Luftwaffe and the war economy, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy in the Nazi Party, Wilhelm Frick, the Minister of the Interior, Walter Funk, the Minister for Economic Affairs, and Hans Lammer, Chief of the Reich Chancellery, who served as Hitler's representative on the council. Within this council existed a smaller subcommittee consisting of Göring, Keitel, and Frick, empowered to issue decrees. The extent of the Council of Ministers for the Defense of the Reich's actual authority remains a subject of extensive debate. It demonstrably possessed and exercised oversight over numerous matters pertaining to war, material production, and logistical concerns, but it would be inaccurate to assert its possession of a significant decision-making role in the strategic planning of the war. Once the Second World War commenced, Hitler assumed command, and decisions were rendered by him and whichever generals, ministers, and officials he chose to consult at any given juncture. Initially, the war progressed exceptionally favorably for Germany. Poland was conquered within weeks in September 1939. Subsequently, following a winter of consolidation, Denmark and Norway were occupied in the spring of 1940 through 2 targeted campaigns, affording Germany a strategic advantage in the North Atlantic. With these objectives achieved in early May 1940, the German armed forces swiftly advanced through the Low Countries for the second time in 26 years to invade France. A campaign spearheaded by German panzer tank divisions rapidly captured Paris and forced the British Expeditionary Force to the north coast near Dunkirk, from which they narrowly executed a daring naval evacuation to Britain. Despite this limited success, Britain stood alone by the end of June 1940 against Germany in Western Europe, and Nazi flags were flying over capital cities from Paris to Warsaw. Keitel oversaw the armistice negotiations with the French that summer, resulting in the establishment of a puppet state governing southern France for the war's duration. These conquests appear to have profoundly impressed Keitel, who reportedly proclaimed Hitler to be the greatest general of all time. This assertion would be tested and proven demonstrably fallacious in subsequent years. Keitel was rewarded by Hitler in the aftermath of the conquest of Western Europe. He was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal on July 19, 1940. Concurrently, he received an endowment of 100,000 Reichsmarks, a substantial sum that appears to have embarrassed him, as he remarked that one typically did not attain Field Marshal status after years spent completing paperwork at a desk. He deposited the funds in a bank account and never utilized them. However, certain changes in the summer of 1940 appeared to undermine his position. It was at this juncture that Dr. Fritz Todt was placed in charge of a new Ministry of War Production, with responsibility for manufacturing war material and armaments. This constituted a core remit of Keitel's office and could be construed as a snub to the OKW office, but from a pragmatic standpoint, it made sense given the ever-escalating volume of responsibilities thrust upon Keitel. In the summer of 1940, Keitel was also enlisted in planning for a proposed German invasion of Russia. The Nazis had long regarded the Bolshevik communists of the Soviet Union as their ideological adversaries, and the treaty they had concluded in 1939 was merely a temporary alliance of convenience between the two nations. Thus, a conference was convened on July 31, 1940, mere weeks after the cessation of hostilities in Western Europe, where Hitler consulted with Germany's senior military commanders regarding the feasibility of launching an invasion of Russia and its probability of success. Keitel was included alongside figures such as Alfred Jodl, Keitel's close associate in the OKW, and Erich Raeder, head of the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. At the meeting, they generally voiced objections, contending that German military capacity could not match Russia's at full strength, and that any proposed invasion should certainly await the conquest or capitulation of Britain. Despite their reservations, they were commanded to report back to Hitler on the logistical aspects involved. The ensuing report highlighted challenges Germany would encounter in maintaining supplies of vital war materials, such as rubber, upon declaring war on the Soviet Union. Notwithstanding his general apprehensions regarding the feasibility of a German invasion of Russia, Keitel omitted these sections from the report, asserting that Hitler would not countenance such negativity impeding his objectives. Ultimately, the invasion proceeded. In the summer of 1941, Germany initiated the largest land invasion in military history, deploying hundreds of thousands of personnel into eastern Poland and Ukraine en route to Russia. As in Western Europe the preceding year, Operation Barbarossa, as it was codenamed, initially progressed exceptionally well. Throughout August 1941, German front lines surged ever further northeastward toward the primary targets of Leningrad and Moscow. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin contemplated negotiating peace terms that would cede vast tracts of land in Poland and Ukraine to Germany, but ultimately resolved against it. This decision proved judicious in the long term. As winter descended, the German advance stalled short of capturing the two major Russian cities. Subsequently, as temperatures plummeted further, the Germans realized their inadequate provision of clothing for the severe Russian winter. Keitel was centrally involved in the logistical efforts required to rectify this situation in the weeks that followed, but ultimately it was not the cold, but sheer manpower that would prove decisive. As 1941 transitioned into 1942, the Germans failed to conclude the conflict, and as ever more Russians were conscripted into the Red Army, and their war economy shifted into overdrive, the tide began to turn. When a final German push to seize the southern city of Stalingrad faltered the following autumn, the movement of soldiers reversed direction, and gradually from early 1943, the Russians began to drive the Germans back toward Berlin. Throughout these years, Keitel continued to function as chief of the OWK, overseeing much of the Wehrmacht's logistical and organizational operations with his staff in Berlin. He was also regularly dispatched to capitals such as Budapest, Bucharest, and Helsinki to manage Germany's negotiations with its smaller military allies in Europe, including Hungary, Romania, and Finland. By this time, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with his position, remarking in his private notes his desire to be relieved of his duties. Indeed, he had attempted to resign on at least 3 occasions before the war's conclusion, but Hitler had consistently refused his requests, despite their increasingly frequent disagreements. This interpersonal discord constituted a recurring feature of life for senior German generals between 1941 and 1944. Enshrined within his Wolf's Lair, his base on the Eastern Front in Poland, Hitler was evolving into an irrational, embittered individual, afflicted by numerous severe physical ailments and a burgeoning addiction to a cocktail of potent drugs including amphetamine, cocaine, and morphine. This was the individual with whom Keitel had to interact throughout the remainder of the Second World War. Yet little sympathy is warranted for him, as Keitel was also profoundly complicit in the ever-expanding litany of war crimes and atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime. He had been fully cognizant, as early as the invasion of Poland in the autumn of 1939, of the actions of the Einsatzgruppen, effectively SS death squads deployed into conquered territories following the German Heer's initial advance to perpetrate the mass extermination of groups deemed enemies of the Nazi state. Back in 1941, it would have been apparent to him that their activities had escalated to extreme brutality, exemplified by the Babi Yar massacre. In this horrific event, a staggering 3,771 Jewish individuals were murdered within a mere 48 hours. Other groups targeted included Soviet POWs, Roma, and individuals with disabilities. Keitel's involvement wasn't simply a matter of awareness, he was an active participant in these atrocities. Notably, in May of 1941, he endorsed the Directives for the Conduct of the Troops in Russia. This order explicitly identified Bolshevik civilians and Jewish people in Eastern Europe as groups against whom ruthless measures were permissible. That September, Keitel followed up with a further directive to guarantee the comprehensive execution of these guidelines. Correspondence from this era suggests a personal anti-Jewish sentiment that went beyond mere adherence to Nazi ideology. Just a few months later, Keitel played a pivotal role in enacting the Night and Fog Decree in December 1941. This decree was implemented via the OKW, and Keitel was the key figure in conveying Hitler's command. The decree mandated that suspected political opponents in occupied territories across Europe, including France, Poland, and Austria, could be arrested and transported to German territory. Subsequently, these individuals could be detained within Germany and interrogated using military procedures. The underlying purpose was to facilitate the deportation of specific nationalities, notably from regions in France, the Low Countries, and elsewhere. This was happening in areas where the Nazis were still attempting to conceal actions that were being carried out openly in Eastern Europe. In practice, the Night and Fog Decree resulted in the detention and transportation of tens of thousands of political prisoners to the network of concentration camps established by the Nazis across Central and Eastern Europe. By late 1941, these camps were the sites where European Jews and other groups like the Roma were being systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. By early 1943, the situation was not only that Russian forces had commenced pushing the German army back towards Poland and Ukraine. The German Expeditionary Force in North Africa, dispatched to support Italy, Germany's ally, also suffered defeat that spring at the hands of the British and their newly joined allies, the United States, who had entered the conflict in the final weeks of 1941. Victory in North Africa was succeeded by the invasion of Sicily and Italy by the Western Allies during the summer of 1943. Subsequently, when the Italian government ousted its fascist leader, Benito Mussolini, and sought to negotiate peace terms with the Allies, Hitler committed further resources to establishing a separate Italian government in northern Italy. This new entity was nominally headed by Mussolini but functioned as a German puppet administration. Then in the summer of 1944, British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces initiated a Western Front in northern France. The subsequent liberation of France, while not as swift as Germany's initial occupation in 1941, proceeded at a considerable pace. Simultaneously, as Russian forces advanced westward through Poland and Ukraine, the overall situation became increasingly critical. By the initial weeks of 1945, Russian troops were advancing into eastern Germany, while the Western Allies were moving into the Rhineland. The war's outcome was now undeniable, although the specifics of the final stages remained uncertain. The deteriorating military circumstances did spark some limited resistance within Germany. Of particular note was a plot conceived in the summer of 1944 by a group of German military officers under the leadership of Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Their aim was to assassinate Hitler using a briefcase bomb planted near him during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair on July 20, 1944. The bomb did detonate after Stauffenberg's departure, injuring almost everyone in the room, but Hitler survived because the conference table absorbed much of the explosion before it reached him. In the immediate aftermath, Keitel was crucial in communicating with base commanders in Berlin and elsewhere to prevent Stauffenberg from enacting the second phase of the plan. This involved launching a coup in Berlin and then attempting negotiations with the Allies. Consequently, the plot was swiftly suppressed. Following this, Keitel became a member of the military tribunal tasked with interrogating hundreds of military personnel to identify those involved with Stauffenberg. Ultimately, over 7,000 individuals were arrested and approximately 5,000 were executed, many after enduring torture aimed at uncovering the extent of the plot within the military and civil administration. The failure of the July 20th plot guaranteed that Berlin would face a brutal siege by the Allied forces. Hitler remained resolute against surrender, and any attempts to urge him towards negotiations were considered almost treasonous. Instead, elderly men and teenage boys were armed to try and impede the Russian advance into Berlin, while Hitler spent his final days in the bunker beneath the Reich chancellery in the city center. The Battle of Berlin commenced in mid-April 1945 once Russian forces had encircled the city and severed supply lines. Despite relentless shelling and being defended by what was far from an effective army, the German forces held out for over 2 weeks. Remarkably, Keitel advocated for counterattacks during this period to push back the Russians, a tactical impossibility at that point. By the final days of April, the end was clearly approaching. Hitler ultimately took his own life in the Reich Chancellery bunker on April 30, 1945. The following day, his designated successor, Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, followed suit. Berlin's garrisons surrendered on May 2nd, bringing an end to the fighting in the capital. Now, only the formalization of peace remained. In the Reich's final days, numerous senior members of the regime and military began to leave Berlin, heading towards northern Germany and the Danish border. This part of Germany remained unoccupied by the Allies as the British, Americans, and other Western allies deemed it not strategically significant enough to warrant diverting forces northward during their eastward advance to Berlin. Consequently, a provisional government was established in the town of Flensburg near the German-Danish border at the beginning of May following the suicides of Hitler and Goebbels in Berlin. This government was headed by Karl Donitz, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, who briefly became president of Germany after Hitler's death. The Flensburg government's primary function was to officially conclude the war. Perhaps those in Flensburg who had overseen the Nazi regime's reign of terror across Europe since 1939 speculated about their future. Accounts from the time and memoirs suggest that some believed that conflict between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was imminent, and that Germany would quickly be rehabilitated once the subsequent war began. Some even harbored the delusional belief that National Socialism, in some iteration, would survive in Germany. They were soon disabused of this notion. Keitel was among the first to be arrested on May 13th, just 5 days after signing the surrender in Berlin, on the orders of U.S. military police. He was swiftly taken to the Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg. There he was soon joined by many other high-ranking surviving members of the Nazi regime in the German military, notably Hermann Göring, Reich Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hans Frank, the head of the general government in occupied Poland, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the SS commander who had governed the occupied Netherlands during the war. These individuals were held captive in what was codenamed Camp Ashkan until the Allies were ready to bring them to trial. Keitel, Göring, Frank, Seyss-Inquart, and others, including German Armaments Minister Albert Speer and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking surviving SS member, were put on trial in late 1945. This became the most significant war crimes trial in the aftermath of World War II. As the chief bureaucrat and organizer of the German armed forces, and effectively the Minister for War from 1938 to 1945, Keitel was undoubtedly going to be tried alongside these senior ministers. They faced multiple charges, the most critical being initiating war in Europe, perpetrating war crimes, and being aware of and involved in the establishment and administration of the concentration camp system. These individuals were on trial for almost a full year in Nuremberg, from late 1945 to the autumn of 1946. Finding a German lawyer to represent Keitel, who had pleaded not guilty, proved difficult. Throughout the proceedings, his defense was that, as a military officer, he was merely following the orders of his direct superior, Hitler, throughout the war. The tribunal rejected this defense, arguing that the crimes committed in the concentration camps and elsewhere, which Keitel was aware of and complicit in, were so abhorrent that no command structure justified obedience. It was also explicitly mentioned that he had signed and overseen the implementation of the Night and Fog Decree when he was sentenced. Consequently, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Keitel requested to be executed by firing squad, as befitting a German military officer. However, this request was denied on the grounds that his actions were criminal, not military. Thus, he was to be hanged on October 16, 1946, just days after the trial concluded, along with others like Frank and Kaltenbrunner, who had also received death sentences. Göring committed suicide in his cell the night before, making Keitel the second to be executed after Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The method used by the American executioners was a standard long drop technique, where the condemned would have a noose placed around their neck and then be dropped through a trap door. However, Keitel's execution was bungled. As he fell through the trap door, his face struck the edge, breaking his nose. Furthermore, the American executioner, John C. Woods, had miscalculated the rope length for some prisoners. Consequently, several of those executed that day did not die quickly from a broken neck, but were strangled to death. In Keitel's case, it took 24 minutes for his convulsions to completely cease. In subsequent executions following later trials at Nuremberg, the method was adjusted to prevent any recurrence of these botched executions. Once the executions concluded on October 16th, Keitel and Göring's bodies, along with the bodies of the other 9, were cremated in Munich, and their ashes were scattered in the river Isar in southern Bavaria. Wilhelm Keitel is a complex figure to evaluate as a high-ranking member of the Nazi regime. On one hand, he appears to have been a powerful individual, fully complicit in the multitude of crimes committed by Nazi Germany. During the mid-1930s, he oversaw the bureaucracy involved in German rearmament, while from 1938 to 1945, he was effectively the Minister for War and head of the Wehrmacht, accountable only to Hitler. Yet simultaneously, it's hard to shake the impression that Keitel was often a powerless functionary, someone who managed vast amounts of paperwork and was considered a toady. This was certainly the view of many higher-ranking members of the regime and army, who often didn't bother to salute Keitel, their supposed superior. However, regardless of how much these nuances might suggest that Keitel was merely a military officer blindly following orders, he still possessed his own agency, however limited. He was also profoundly involved personally in facilitating the actions of the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front and initiating the Night and Fog Decree. Considering all of this, the judgment of the Nuremberg tribunal was undoubtedly correct, that no matter how much Keitel might have argued, he was simply obeying orders as a military officer. His duty as a human being was to refuse those orders. Therefore, he was as much a war criminal as the others he was tried alongside at Nuremberg.